The air in Aura was not merely air, it was a curated atmosphere, a meticulously filtered environment where oxygen seemed to be a commodity purchased at a premium. It smelled of old money, of leather-bound portfolios, and the subtle, earthy perfume of black truffles being shaved over plates costing more than a month's rent. Light did not simply illuminate the room. It dripped from colossal crystal chandeliers, each one a frozen constellation suspended in the perpetual twilight of the dining space. The sound was a symphony of hushed power, the gentle clinking of silver cutlery against fine porcelain, the murmur of voices discussing mergers and acquisitions in tones that were both confidential and performative. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the sprawling metropolis below, a glittering tapestry of lights that seemed to exist purely for the viewing pleasure of the titans who dined here. This was not a restaurant, it was a sanctuary, a golden cocoon where the world's most powerful people came to feast, to conspire, and to reinforce the unbreachable distance between themselves and the rest of humanity. Every detail, from the thread count of the linen napkins to the silent, almost imperceptible service, was designed to make its patrons feel like gods observing the mortal world from their own private Olympus. Clara Vance moved through this gilded world like a phantom, a study in practiced invisibility. Her movements were economical, precise, honed by hundreds of nights spent navigating the narrow channels between tables occupied by men who could buy and sell entire countries. She refilled water glasses with a wrist that never trembled, placed plates on the table with a silence that bordered on supernatural, and maintained a facade of serene professionalism that was her most essential piece of armor. Her black uniform was simple, functional, designed to make her blend into the polished mahogany and shadowed corners of the room. To the patrons of Aura, she was not a person but a function, a pair of hands that appeared when needed and vanished when not. But beneath this placid surface, a different mind was at work. While her body performed the rote ballet of a high-end waitress, her mind, a precision instrument forged at MIT, was constantly calculating, analyzing, and remembering. She saw the structural stress points in the building's architecture, the inefficient fluid dynamics of the wine being poured, the complex interplay of social hierarchies at every table. It was a mind starved of real problems, forced to chew on the mundane to keep from atrophying. The weight of her purpose was heavier than any silver tray she carried. Every forced smile, every polite nod was a small sacrifice laid at the altar of her father's well-being. The sterile, white-walled image of his room at the long-term care facility was seared into her consciousness, a constant, driving force that propelled her through the exhaustion and the quiet indignities of her job. She could still feel the phantom sensation of his workshop, the comforting scent of machine oil and hot metal, the feel of his large, calloused hands guiding her smaller ones as he taught her the secret language of machines. He had been a genius, a poet of mechanics who saw locks not as barriers, but as intricate puzzles, mechanical sonnets waiting to be read. He had taught her to see the soul in the machine, to understand the delicate dance of pins, tumblers, and springs. That world of creation and innovation had been violently ripped away, replaced by the crushing reality of a hostile takeover by a corporate behemoth that had stolen his patents and left him a broken man. The stroke had followed soon after, a physical manifestation of his shattered spirit. Now, the money she earned in this temple of excess went directly to paying for the quiet dignity of his care, a desperate attempt to preserve the last vestiges of the brilliant man he once was. The atmosphere in Aura shifted, a subtle but palpable change in the room's barometric pressure. It was a shift Clara had learned to recognize. It was the arrival of Alistair Finch. He did not simply walk into the restaurant, he conquered it. He moved with an aura of predatory entitlement, his presence sucking the oxygen from his immediate vicinity. The maître d', a man who regularly greeted senators and CEOs with unflappable poise, seemed to shrink by several inches, his smile becoming strained and obsequious. Finch, dressed in a suit so exquisitely tailored it seemed woven from shadow and arrogance, waved him away with a flick of his wrist, not even deigning to make eye contact. His eyes, the color of polished steel, swept across the room with a look of profound boredom, as if assessing an asset he already owned. He was followed by a small entourage of younger men in equally expensive suits, their faces a mixture of fear and sycophantic admiration. Clara felt a familiar cold knot form in her stomach. Finch was a regular, a man who derived a particular kind of pleasure from casual cruelty, from reminding the service staff of their station with a cutting remark or a dismissive gesture. He was the personification of the world that had crushed her father. The stage is set for a confrontation that will change everything. We're about to travel to the heart of New York City, but first, we'd love to know where this story is reaching you today. Comment your location below, and be sure to subscribe to join our community. Alistair Finch settled into his usual corner booth, the one with the most commanding view of both the city and the restaurant's entrance. His guests arranged themselves around him, their postures radiating a nervous energy, like courtiers attending a volatile king. Clara knew this performance well. It was the Finch Show, a carefully orchestrated display of power and influence designed to impress his current target, in this case a potential investor, with a weathered face and cautious eyes. The conversation, loud enough for the surrounding tables to overhear, was a monologue of Finch's triumphs, a litany of companies he had acquired, markets he had cornered, and rivals he had obliterated. He spoke with a complete lack of humility, framing his predatory business practices as a form of high art. Clara approached the table, her face a neutral mask, to pour the ridiculously expensive mineral water they had ordered. The performance reached its crescendo. To illustrate a point about his firm's obsession with absolute security, Finch produced a sleek, impossibly thin tablet and tapped the screen. A holographic 3D schematic of a safe's locking mechanism materialized above the device, rotating slowly in the dim light. It was a thing of terrifying complexity, a web of interlocking gears, magnetic tumblers, and biometric sensors. Finch gestured toward the image, with the flourish of a magician revealing his greatest trick. He began to pontificate, peppering his speech with technical jargon that he clearly only half understood, his voice dripping with self-satisfaction. He was not just selling his firm's security division, he was selling himself as an untouchable, infallible demigod of commerce. His audience was captivated, their expressions a blend of awe and greed. He was promising them a world without risk, a fortress for their wealth, and they were eager to believe him. He was the high priest of a religion where capital was the only god. Then, in a moment that seemed to freeze time, his gaze fell upon Clara as she stood silently by the table, waiting to take their food order. A cruel, reptilian smile spread across his face. He saw her not as a person, but as a prop, a perfect tool to amplify his own brilliance by highlighting her supposed ignorance. He gestured dismissively in her direction, a flick of his fingers that was meant to encompass her entire existence and find it wanting. His voice boomed with theatrical condescension, silencing the nearby tables. "It is so advanced," he declared. "A person like her," he said, his words a physical blow, "would think it is magic." A wave of sycophantic laughter rippled through his companions, a chorus of derision aimed at the silent woman in the black uniform. The sound was sharp and ugly in the refined atmosphere of the restaurant, a violation of the unspoken code of civility. The investor he was trying to impress shifted uncomfortably, a flicker of distaste in his eyes, but said nothing. Finch, emboldened by the laughter, leaned forward and locked his cold eyes on Clara. The smile never left his face as he delivered the final personal thrust of the knife. "Sweetheart," he asked, his voice a venomous purr, "do you even know what a magnetic tumbler is?" The question hung in the air, thick with contempt. For anyone else, it would have been a moment of profound, public humiliation. But for Clara, it was something else entirely. As he spoke, her eyes were drawn to the rotating schematic on the tablet. It was not just a complex design. It was a ghost. She saw it instantly. The unique curvature of the magnetic array, the unconventional sequencing of the kinetic triggers. It was her father's work. It was his revolutionary patent, stolen, bastardized, and now being flaunted in her face by the very man who had destroyed him. The ambient noise of the restaurant faded into a dull roar. The cold knot in her stomach did not dissolve. It solidified into a block of glacial ice. A fury, pure and silent and absolute, crystallized in her veins, steadying her hands and slowing her breath. The world contracted to a single point of focus, the flawed design on the tablet and the arrogant face of the man presenting it. The laughter of his cronies was a distant, meaningless sound, like the chattering of insects. In that moment, the waitress uniform felt like a costume she was about to shed. Her years of silent suffering, of biting her tongue and swallowing her pride, coalesced into a single, unshakable point of resolve. She looked at the 3D model, and the genius that she had suppressed for so long roared back to life. She didn't just see the design, she saw through it. She saw the critical error his engineers had made, a subtle overcompensation in the magnetic field calibration, a fatal flaw born from the arrogance of believing they had improved upon a master's work. The humiliation he had intended for her was a spark, and it had just landed in a reservoir of gasoline. She stood perfectly still, the tray in her hand feeling as light as a feather, her mind, a weapon that had been dormant for a decade, now fully awake and aimed. The game had just changed, and Alistair Finch had no idea he was already in checkmate. The laughter of Alistair Finch's companions echoed in the suddenly cavernous space of the restaurant, a harsh, metallic sound that scraped against the carefully cultivated elegance of the room. But for Clara Vance, the sound was a distant echo, a meaningless frequency from a world that was rapidly receding. The patronizing question, "Sweetheart, do you even know what a magnetic tumbler is?" did not land as an insult, it was a key. It unlocked a door deep within her, a door she had sealed shut a decade ago, behind which lay the brilliant, grieving engineer from MIT. The image of her father, not frail and lost in a hospital bed, but vibrant and alive in his workshop, flooded her senses. She could smell the sharp, clean scent of metal shavings and lubricating oil, feel the reassuring weight of a micrometer in her hand, hear his deep, patient voice explaining the beautiful, intricate mathematics of a lock's inner world. The humiliation Finch intended was a catalyst, a chemical agent that transmuted years of suppressed grief and quiet desperation into a substance of incredible density and strength. A cold, crystalline fury settled in her core, not hot and explosive, but precise and focused, like a laser beam. The waitress, the invisible functionary, evaporated. In her place stood a strategist, an expert, a woman who had forgotten more about mechanical engineering than Alistair Finch would ever know. Her posture shifted, an almost imperceptible change, but one that radiated an entirely new frequency of authority. Her shoulders straightened, her chin lifted a fraction of an inch, and her eyes, which had been professionally vacant moments before, now held a focus so intense it was unnerving. She met Alistair Finch's smug, reptilian gaze without a trace of fear or subservience. The ambient noise of the restaurant, the clinking of glasses, and the murmur of conversation seemed to fall away, creating a pocket of profound silence around their table. Her voice, when she spoke, was not the polite, deferential tone of a waitress. It was the calm, measured cadence of a lecturer, of an expert delivering an undeniable truth. "Your engineers," she stated, her words clear and cutting, made a critical error in the magnetic array. They overcompensated for the kinetic triggers, creating a harmonic resonance flaw. It is a common mistake for those who reverse engineer a system without understanding its foundational principles. The words were a language Finch did not speak, a technical broadside that left him momentarily speechless, his condescending smile frozen on his face. The laughter from his sycophants died in their throats, replaced by a confused, awkward silence. Finch's recovery was swift, his arrogance a reflex too deeply ingrained to be suppressed for long. A dark flush crept up his neck, a telltale sign of his wounded pride. He let out a short, contemptuous bark of a laugh, a sound devoid of any genuine humor, and you would know how. He sneered, his voice dripping with renewed disdain, attempting to regain control of the narrative, to reassert his dominance over the upstart waitress. He leaned back in his chair, trying to project an image of amused disbelief, but the tightness around his eyes betrayed a flicker of genuine uncertainty. He was a man accustomed to a world where money bought expertise, where uniforms denoted ignorance. The idea that this woman, this servant, could possess knowledge that challenged his multi-million-dollar security team was not just unlikely, it was an affront to the very order of his universe. He was trying to dismiss her, to put her back in her box, but the box had already been shattered. The entire room was now watching, a silent audience to a drama they did not yet understand, but whose tension was thick and palpable. Clara did not deign to answer his question with words. An explanation would be a plea, an attempt to justify herself to a man she no longer recognized as an authority. Instead, her actions would be her credentials. Her gaze dropped from his face to the heavy, ornate silver dinner fork resting beside his plate. With a grace and economy of motion that was almost hypnotic, she reached out and picked it up. She held it in her hand for a moment, not like a piece of cutlery, but like a surgical instrument, feeling its weight, its balance, its structural integrity. The patrons at the nearby tables leaned forward, their expensive meals forgotten. To them, it was a bizarre, incomprehensible act. But in Clara's mind, the fork was already transforming. She saw the lines of stress, the points of leverage, the exact amount of force required to reshape the metal into the tool she needed. It was a simple calculation, a problem in material science she could have solved in her sleep during her sophomore year at MIT. Her movements were fluid and certain, devoid of any hesitation. The world had presented her with a challenge, and she was about to provide a solution. With a calm that was more unsettling than any outburst of anger could have been, she braced the handle of the fork against the solid mahogany edge of the table. She positioned her hands with the precision of a master craftsman, one hand gripping the neck, the other cupped over the tines. Then, she applied pressure. It was not a violent, brutish act of bending. It was a controlled, deliberate application of force, a deep understanding of physics made manifest. The muscles in her forearm and wrist tightened, channeling her strength into a single, focused point. The silver, a metal known for its malleability, groaned softly under the strain, a high, thin sound in the silent room. She did not just bend the tines, she sculpted them, creating two specific, angled prongs, a custom-made tension wrench, and a pick forged from a single piece of silver. The act was a declaration. It was a statement that she saw the world not as it was presented, but for its underlying mechanics, a place where a dinner fork could become a key, and a billionaire's fortress could become a puzzle box. She placed the newly formed tool on the table with a soft click, the polished silver catching the light from the chandeliers above. Then, with the same unhurried confidence, she reached for the tablet displaying the holographic schematic of the $10 million safe. Alistair Finch was so completely thrown by the turn of events that he could only watch, his mouth slightly agape, as she took the device from its stand. Her fingers, which moments ago were clearing plates and refilling water glasses, now moved across the screen with an innate familiarity, manipulating the complex 3D model as if she had designed it herself. She rotated the image, zoomed into the heart of the mechanism, and isolated the magnetic tumbler array where the flaw resided. Her movements were a silent lecture, a masterclass in mechanical engineering being delivered in the middle of a Michelin-starred restaurant. The investor Finch had been trying to impress watched her with an expression of pure, unadulterated fascination, his previous caution replaced by intense curiosity. He was witnessing a display of expertise so raw and undeniable that it transcended the bizarre context of its presentation. Then, she began the demonstration. Using her index finger to represent the tool she had just created, she traced a path on the screen, a precise sequence of movements through the safe's internal architecture. It was a deadly ballet of mechanical intrusion. She explained her actions as she performed them, her voice remaining level and academic. The first prong applies minimal tension to the kinetic actuator, just enough to bypass the initial biometric sensor, which is falsely calibrated. The second prong then exploits the harmonic resonance in the magnetic array. By vibrating it at a specific frequency, you can trick the tumblers into a false set position. It is a design flaw that prioritizes complexity over stability. As her finger completed the final motion on the screen, a simulated, crisp click echoed from the tablet's speakers. It was the sound of the lock disengaging. The sound of a $10 million safe being rendered utterly useless. The holographic image of the intricate mechanism flashed green, displaying a single, damning word, unlocked. A collective gasp swept through the room. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated shock. The quiet, invisible waitress had, in the span of less than 2 minutes, digitally and conceptually dismantled a fortress of modern security with nothing more than a bent fork and a deep understanding of its hidden weaknesses. The silence that followed was absolute, heavier, and more profound than any sound. Finch's cronies stared, their faces a comical mixture of disbelief and horror. The other patrons were frozen, forks halfway to their mouths, their private conversations forgotten. They were witnessing the public, surgical evisceration of a titan, not by a rival, but by a ghost, a member of the service staff who was never meant to have a voice, let alone a mind capable of such a feat. The power dynamic in the room had not just shifted, it had been inverted with the force of a tectonic event. All the money, all the influence, all the tailored suits and performative arrogance had been rendered meaningless by a single, irrefutable display of superior intellect. Clara placed the tablet gently back on its stand, the green, unlocked notification glowing like an epitaph for Alistair Finch's pride. She then picked up the bent silver fork, holding it delicately between her thumb and forefinger, and placed it on the pristine white tablecloth directly in front of him. The makeshift tool looked obscene lying there, a crude piece of evidence from a perfect crime. She leaned in slightly, not in a gesture of intimacy, but of clinical finality, her voice dropping to a near whisper, a sound meant only for him and his immediate guests, yet it carried the weight of a public proclamation. "You should ask for a refund," she said. The words were simple, delivered without malice or triumph, a piece of practical advice offered with the detached air of a consultant. And in that moment, with that single, quiet sentence, she stripped away the last vestiges of his power, leaving him exposed and utterly humiliated in the temple he considered his own. For a long, stretched-out moment, Alistair Finch did not move. He simply stared at the bent fork, then at Clara's impassive face, his mind struggling to process the sheer magnitude of his public emasculation. The color drained from his face, leaving behind a pale, waxy sheen. Then, the shock curdled into a rage so potent it seemed to vibrate in the air around him. It was a primal, narcissistic fury, the incandescent anger of a god who has been proven mortal. His hand, which had been resting on the table, clenched into a fist so tight the knuckles turned white. A low, guttural sound, something between a growl and a choke, escaped his lips. He was a predator cornered, and like any cornered animal, he lashed out not with intellect, but with the raw, brute force of his power. He could not challenge her on the battlefield of the mind. She had already conquered that territory, so he would destroy her on the only battlefield he knew, the world of money and influence. His eyes, burning with a cold, murderous light, darted around the room until they found their target. The restaurant manager, a man named Julian, who was hovering near the kitchen entrance, his face a mask of abject terror. Finch did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He beckoned with a single, sharp jerk of his head, a gesture of absolute command. Julian scurried over to the table, his movements small and fearful, his eyes avoiding Clara's. Finch leaned in, his voice a low, venomous hiss that was far more terrifying than any shout. "Julian," he began, the name itself a threat. "I want her gone. Not at the end of her shift. Not in an hour. I want her out of my sight right now. I don't care what it costs. I don't care what your policies are. If I see her face in this building again in the next 60 seconds, I will not only never return, I will make it my personal mission to ensure that every single one of my associates and their companies blacklist this establishment. I will ruin you." The threat was not an exaggeration. It was a promise, delivered with the chilling certainty of a man who had ruined countless others for far less. Julian visibly trembled. He was a man caught in an impossible position, trapped between his duty to his employee and the existential threat to his livelihood and the restaurant he had managed for 15 years. He looked at Clara, his eyes pleading for her to say something, to apologize, to do anything that might diffuse the situation. But Clara remained silent, her expression unreadable. She had known this was coming. It was the predictable, brutish response of a man like Finch. In his world, problems were not solved, they were eliminated. Julian's gaze flickered between Finch's incandescent rage and Clara's unnerving calm. And he made the only choice a man in his position could make. He chose survival. He turned to Clara, his face pale and slick with sweat. "Clara," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper, "please, gather your things. I have to ask you to leave." The words were an apology and a termination, a betrayal born of fear. It was a quiet, pathetic end to her employment. A final, predictable move in a game she had already transcended. Clara simply nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement, not of defeat. There was no anger in her expression, no plea for fairness. She had played her hand, and she was prepared for the consequences. As she turned to walk away from the table, a new sound entered the charged atmosphere. It was the voice of the investor, the man Finch had been so desperate to impress. The man, whose name she would later learn was Robert Mercer, a respected figure in the tech world, spoke with a clear, calm authority that cut through the tension. "Alistair," he said, his eyes fixed not on Finch but on Clara's retreating back, "I think I have seen everything I need to see tonight." He placed his napkin on the table, a gesture of finality. His meaning was unmistakable. The deal was off. He had come to assess Alistair Finch's judgment and character, and in the span of 5 minutes, he had been given a masterclass in both, and found them profoundly wanting. The look of utter devastation that washed over Finch's face was a small, satisfying victory, but Clara knew it was only the beginning. She was escorted towards the back exit by a nervous security guard, a silent walk of shame that felt more like a victory lap. The eyes of the entire restaurant staff followed her, their expressions a mixture of awe, fear, and a vicarious, thrilling sense of triumph. She had done what none of them had ever dared to do. She had spoken truth to power, and power had blinked. As she passed the bar on her way to the employee locker room, she overheard 2 of Finch's younger associates speaking in hushed, frantic tones. "I can't believe he did that," one said, in front of Robert Mercer, of all people. "The name Alistair Finch of Finch Capital will be mud by morning." The name hit Clara with the force of a physical blow, a jolt of ice and electricity that shot through her entire body. Finch Capital. The name from her nightmares. The corporate entity that had appeared in the legal documents. The faceless behemoth that had devoured her father's company, Vance Security Innovations, and left him a hollow shell. It was him. The man who had mocked her, the man who had just had her fired, was the architect of her family's destruction. The realization was a clarifying fire, burning away any lingering shock or uncertainty. This was no longer about a moment of public humiliation or a lost waitressing job. This was about a decade of pain, a lifetime of stolen potential, a father's broken spirit. The cold fury that had solidified in the restaurant now had a name and a face. It was not just a personal insult. It was a declaration of a war that had been waged against her family 10 years ago. A war she had just unknowingly re-entered. The fight was not over, it had just been given a purpose. The quiet indignity of her dismissal was no longer a defeat, it was a liberation. She was free from the need to be invisible, free from the pretense of servitude. She was free to become the weapon her father had inadvertently forged. The casual cruelty of Alistair Finch had not just cost him a deal, It had awakened an enemy he never knew existed, an enemy who knew all of his secrets because she was the daughter of the man from whom he had stolen them. She walked out of the gilded cage of aura and into the cool, indifferent air of the New York City night. The sounds of the city, the distant wail of a siren, the rumble of the subway beneath her feet, felt real and grounding after the artificial atmosphere of the restaurant. She did not feel despair. She did not feel fear. She felt a profound and terrifying sense of clarity. For years she had been treading water, surviving day to day, her brilliance channeled into the mundane tasks of remembering who ordered the steak medium rare and who preferred sparkling water. Now that brilliant mind had been given a singular, all-consuming problem to solve: the complete and total dismantling of Alistair Finch and his corrupt empire. The grief for her father, which had been a heavy, passive weight for so long, now transformed into fuel, a high-octane propellant for the mission that lay ahead. She was no longer just Clara Vance, the caregiver, the waitress. She was the living legacy of Vance Security Innovations, and she was coming to collect a debt that was 10 years overdue. She reached her small, sparsely furnished apartment, the contrast with the opulence of Aura, a stark reminder of the world Finch had stolen from her. The space was neat, organized, the home of a mind that craved order. But tonight, she did not see the worn furniture or the view of a brick wall. She saw a war room. She walked over to an old wooden chest, a relic from her father's workshop, and opened it. Inside, beneath a few sentimental keepsakes, were her old textbooks from MIT, her notebooks filled with complex equations and designs, and a set of specialized lock-picking tools her father had made for her as a teenager, teaching her the craft not for theft, but as an intellectual exercise, a way to understand the heart of a machine. She ran her fingers over the cool, familiar metal of the tools. They felt like an extension of herself, a part of her she had been forced to amputate. It was time to reacquaint herself with who she was. Her first move was not one of passion, but of strategy. She knew she could not fight a man like Finch alone. He was a fortress of lawyers and corporate power. She needed an ally, someone who understood the world she was about to enter, someone who could help her navigate the complex maze of corporate law and intellectual property rights. Her mind immediately went to one person, Professor Damien Albright, her former mentor at MIT, a man with a brilliant legal mind, a fierce sense of academic integrity, and a deep-seated disdain for corporate predators like Finch. He had been devastated when she dropped out, always believing she was destined for greatness. She found his university contact information online, her fingers steady as she dialed the number. The phone rang 3 times before a familiar, warm voice answered, a voice she hadn't heard in almost a decade. "Professor Albright?" she said, her own voice sounding strange to her ears. "This is Clara Vance. I need your help." She explained everything. The restaurant, the public humiliation, the revelation of Finch's identity, and the deep, dark history connecting him to her father's ruin. She spoke with a calm, factual precision, laying out the events not as a victim, but as an analyst presenting a case study. On the other end of the line, Professor Albright listened in stunned silence, his occasional interjections of shock and outrage growing into a cold, focused anger. He remembered her father's work, had even cited one of his early papers in a lecture. The story she told was not just a personal tragedy. It was a profound violation of the principles of innovation and intellectual honesty that he held sacred. When she finished, there was a long pause on the line, and for a terrifying moment, Clara feared he would dismiss it as an unwinnable fight, a futile crusade against a giant. But when Albright finally spoke, his voice was firm, resolute, and filled with a righteous indignation that mirrored her own. "Clara," he said, his words a balm on a decade-old wound, "what that man did to your father was a crime. What he did to you tonight was a declaration. We are not going to let him get away with it." He didn't offer pity, he offered an alliance. He told her to meet him at his university office the next morning. He would start digging into Finch Capital's corporate filings, searching for the original acquisition papers for Vance Security Innovations. He still had contacts at the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. He would find the paper trail. He told her to bring everything she had, her father's old notes, his patent applications, anything that could prove his original ownership of the designs Finch had built his empire upon. For the first time in 10 years, Clara Vance did not feel alone. The weight of her mission was still immense, but now, it was a burden she would share. As she hung up the phone, a sense of profound purpose settled over her. The path ahead would be fraught with danger and difficulty, but it was a clear path. The fog of survival had lifted, replaced by the sharp, clear lines of a strategic objective. She looked at the reflection of the woman in the dark window of her apartment. The tired, invisible waitress was gone. In her place was a woman she vaguely recognized from a long time ago. A woman with fire in her eyes and a mind like a steel trap. Alistair Finch had made a critical error, far greater than any flaw in his $10 million safe. He had underestimated his opponent. He had assumed the person serving his water was just part of the scenery, a non-player character in the grand drama of his life. He had no idea he had just insulted the one person in the world who knew how to dismantle his entire existence. Piece by intricate piece. The hunt had begun. The first step was to gather the evidence, to build an arsenal of truth that would be impervious to Finch's army of lawyers. Clara spent the rest of the night meticulously going through her father's old files, which she had preserved with an almost religious devotion. The smell of old paper and ink filled her small apartment, a scent that was as comforting as a memory. She found the original patent filings for the magnetic tumbler system, each page filled with her father's precise handwriting and detailed schematics. She found his lab notes, documenting every breakthrough, every setback, every moment of brilliant insight. It was all there, a perfect, undeniable record of his genius. As she worked, she felt her father's presence in the room with her, not as a ghost, but as a source of strength. His legacy, a weapon she was now learning to wield. She was no longer just fighting for him. She was fighting with him. The next morning, she met Professor Albright in his office, a chaotic, book-lined sanctuary that smelled of old leather and intellectual fervor. She laid out her father's documents on his large oak desk, creating a timeline of innovation and theft. Albright examined the papers with the keen eye of a forensic accountant, his excitement growing with each page he turned. "It's all here, Clara," he said, his voice buzzing with energy. The patent numbers, the dates of filing, the technical specifications. Finch didn't just steal the idea. He copied the design verbatim and filed it under a subsidiary shell corporation to obscure the theft. This isn't just a civil case for patent infringement. This is corporate fraud on a massive scale. He explained their strategy. They would not go to Finch directly. A man like that would simply bury them in legal motions until she ran out of money and hope. They needed to find a bigger stage, a moment of maximum vulnerability, where the truth would have the most devastating impact. Their target became clear: Finch Capital's upcoming annual shareholder meeting, a highly publicized event attended by investors, board members, and the financial press. It was Finch's grandest stage. The one day a year he stood before the world to celebrate his own genius and the success of his empire. It was the perfect place to expose the rotten foundations upon which that empire was built. Albright would use his credentials to secure her a proxy pass to attend the meeting as a representative of a small block of university-held shares. Her role would be to wait for the Q&A session, to step up to the microphone, and to present her evidence not to a judge or a jury, but to the very people whose money and trust Finch depended on. It was a high-risk, high-reward strategy, a corporate ambush designed to strike at the heart of his power. The weeks leading up to the shareholder meeting were a blur of intense, round-the-clock preparation. Clara and Albright worked tirelessly, transforming her small apartment into a command center. They dug deeper, unearthing more evidence of Finch's predatory practices, finding a pattern of asset stripping and intellectual property theft that went far beyond her father's case. They discovered a former engineer from Finch's security division, a man who had quit in disgust after being forced to work on the stolen Vance designs. After some persuasion from Albright, he agreed to provide a sworn affidavit becoming their insider, a crucial witness who could corroborate every technical claim Clara made. They were not just building a case, they were forging a narrative of justice, a story so compelling and well documented that it would be impossible for the world to ignore. Clara felt herself transforming, the dormant parts of her mind coming back online with astonishing speed. She was no longer just an engineer, she was becoming a tactician, a warrior. On the eve of the shareholder meeting, Clara visited her father at the care facility. She sat by his bedside, holding his frail, unresponsive hand, and told him everything. She told him about Alistair Finch, about the restaurant, and about the plan for the next day. She didn't know how much he could understand, but as she spoke, she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a glimmer of the old fire, a tear that traced a slow path down his wrinkled cheek. She squeezed his hand and made him a silent promise. This was not about revenge. Revenge was a messy, emotional affair. This was about restoration. It was about reclaiming his name, his legacy, and the truth that had been buried for a decade. She was his daughter, but she was also his final, most ingenious invention. A key designed to unlock the truth, a fail-safe he never knew he had created, now perfectly positioned to dismantle the system that had tried to destroy him. The stage was set for the final act. The morning of the Finch Capital shareholder meeting arrived, a crisp, clear autumn day that belied the storm that was about to break. Clara stood before the mirror in her apartment, but she did not see a waitress. She saw a woman dressed in a simple, professional business suit, an armor of competence and seriousness. Her hair was pulled back neatly, her face was clear of makeup, and her eyes held a calm, unwavering resolve. She was not the same person who had been unceremoniously fired from Aura just a few weeks ago. That person had been a survivor, living in the shadow of a past tragedy. The woman in the mirror was an agent of that past, a force of reckoning that had been a decade in the making. She picked up the slim leather portfolio containing her father's original patents, the sworn affidavit from the engineer, and the irrefutable proof of Finch's fraud. It was heavier than any physical object, but the full weight of a decade of silenced truth, a burden she now carried with a strength she never knew she possessed. The portfolio was not just evidence, it was a promise, a declaration that the era of invisibility was over, and the time for a public reckoning had finally come. The woman in the mirror met her own gaze, and for the first time in 10 years she did not see a victim. She saw the daughter of a genius, and she was ready for war. The weeks that followed her dismissal from Aura were a descent into a world of paper and digital ghosts. Professor Albright's office became their sanctuary and their war room, a cluttered academic haven piled high with legal texts and engineering journals that smelled of aging paper, leather, and brewing coffee. For Clara, it was a homecoming. The complex language of patent law and corporate filings, which would have been impenetrable to most, was to her just another type of mechanical system, a labyrinth of clauses and subclauses designed to obscure and protect. She attacked the work with a ferocious, single-minded intensity that stunned even Albright, who had remembered her as a brilliant student but was now witnessing a master strategist at work. She slept in 4-hour increments, fueled by caffeine and a cold, burning sense of purpose that left no room for exhaustion. The image of her father, listless in his sterile room, was a constant fire at her back, preventing any thought of retreat. They began with the acquisition papers for Vance Security Innovations. The documents were a monument to corporate predation, written in a language of such sterile brutality that it made Clara's stomach clench. Words like asset liquidation, intellectual property transfer, and redundancy protocols were used to describe the systematic dismantling of her father's life's work. She could see the ghost of her father in the margins, in the frantic, last-minute amendments he had been forced to sign, his signature becoming shakier with each page. She traced the lines of his name with her finger, the paper a fragile connection to the man he had been before Finch had broken him. Albright provided the legal context, his voice a low, angry hum, as he pointed out the predatory loopholes and coercive tactics Finch Capital had used to force the sale for a fraction of its true worth. It was a perfectly legal, perfectly immoral masterpiece of corporate destruction. The paper trail was a hydra, a beast with many heads. For every document they uncovered, Finch Capital had created 3 more to obscure its path, routing the ownership of the patents through a dizzying series of offshore shell corporations with meaningless, anonymous names. They spent days mapping the flow of ownership, the wall of Albright's office slowly disappearing behind a web of whiteboards covered in diagrams and sticky notes, a chaotic mural of a single colossal crime. It was designed to exhaust and demoralize anyone who dared to investigate, a fortress of bureaucratic complexity. There were moments of deep frustration, nights when Clara would stare at the labyrinthine charts until her vision blurred, a cold tendril of doubt creeping into her heart. Finch was a master of concealment, a predator who knew how to cover his tracks in a blizzard of paperwork. It was during one of these late nights, surrounded by empty coffee cups and the low hum of the university's ventilation system, that they hit the critical wall. The final shell corporation, registered in a tiny, non-cooperative island nation, was a dead end. Its ownership was shielded by impenetrable privacy laws. For a moment, the air in the room felt heavy with defeat. Albright slumped back in his chair, rubbing his tired eyes. "They can't hide the technology, Clara, but they can hide the money trail," he murmured, the frustration evident in his voice. "This proves the theft to a moral certainty, but Finch's lawyers will argue it's not a legal certainty. They'll drown us in jurisdictional challenges." The thought of Finch escaping on a technicality, of her father's legacy being denied by a legal trick, sent a wave of icy fury through Clara, renewing her resolve. There had to be another way. She pushed back from the table, her mind racing, searching for a different kind of key, a different kind of lock to pick. The flaw in Finch's safe wasn't in its strength, but in its complexity. He had over-engineered it. She had a sudden, intuitive leap that his corporate structure would have the same kind of flaw. He had built a fortress of paper, but fortresses need people to run them. People are not perfect. People have memories, and people have consciences. "We're looking in the wrong place," she said, her voice cutting through the silence of the room. "We don't need to follow the paper. We need to find the hands that built the machine. We need to find an engineer, someone from inside Finch's security division who worked on this project. Someone who would know they were working with stolen designs." Albright's eyes lit up, the spark of the fight returning to his face. It was a long shot, a search for a needle in a corporate haystack, but it was a tangible, human path forward. They shifted their focus from legal databases to professional networks and old employee rosters. They spent the next week cross-referencing names, searching for anyone who had worked at Finch Capital's security R&D division during the period the Vance patents were being integrated and then subsequently left the company. The list was short. Finch paid his top engineers exorbitant salaries to ensure their loyalty and silence. But one name stood out: Marcus Thorne, a senior kinetic systems engineer who had resigned abruptly 7 years ago, citing personal reasons. His career trajectory after leaving Finch Capital was a steep, inexplicable decline. A man with his qualifications should have been a star in the industry, but he had instead bounced between low-level consulting gigs before seemingly dropping off the map. Finding him was a challenge. He had no professional online presence, no updated profiles. It was as if he was actively trying to be invisible. Using Albright's university resources, they managed to track down a last known address, a rundown apartment building in a forgotten corner of Queens. The address itself was a red flag, a clear sign that something had gone terribly wrong in Marcus Thorne's life. Clara knew she had to be the one to approach him. This wasn't a conversation for a lawyer. It required a personal touch, an appeal from one engineer to another. She felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach as she prepared to go. She was stepping out from behind the curtain of research and into a direct confrontation, a move that could either give them the final piece of their puzzle or alert Finch that someone was digging into his past. There was no turning back now. The apartment building smelled of damp concrete and boiled cabbage, a world away from the curated atmosphere of Aura. The paint on the hallway walls was peeling, and the single, flickering fluorescent light cast long, distorted shadows. Clara's heart pounded against her ribs as she stood before apartment 4B. She knocked, the sound echoing in the oppressive silence. For a long moment, there was no answer. She could hear the faint sound of a television from within. She knocked again, louder this time. The sound of a chain being drawn, and multiple locks being disengaged, was her only welcome. The door opened a few inches, and a pair of wary, bloodshot eyes peered out at her. The man, Marcus Thorne, looked older than his years, his face etched with a deep, weary paranoia. He was thin, almost gaunt, and his clothes were frayed at the edges. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice a hoarse, suspicious whisper. He looked her up and down, his gaze lingering on the professional portfolio she carried, and his eyes narrowed further. He was a man who had been expecting a ghost from his past to appear at his door for 7 years, and now one had. Clara kept her voice calm and steady, introducing herself not as a victim or an accuser, but as a fellow engineer. "I need to talk to you about a project you worked on at Finch Capital," she said. "I need to talk to you about the Vance magnetic tumbler system." At the mention of the name, every bit of color drained from Thorne's face. He tried to slam the door shut, a reflex of pure terror, but Clara was ready. She put her foot in the doorway, a small act of physical resistance that surprised them both. "Please," she said, her voice now pleading but still firm. "He destroyed my father. I think he destroyed you too." Her words, the raw, undeniable truth in them, seemed to break through his wall of fear. He hesitated, his eyes searching her face, and he saw not a threat, but a reflection of his own broken past. With a sigh of profound resignation, he unlatched the chain and let her in. The apartment was sparse and cluttered, filled with the detritus of a life that had been put on hold. Old engineering textbooks were stacked on the floor, and a half-finished schematic for some personal project was taped to the wall. He had been a creator, and Finch had turned him into a ghost. He listened in silence as Clara told him the entire story, his expression shifting from fear to a slow-burning, righteous anger. He had always suspected the designs were too perfect, too revolutionary to have been developed in-house. He had raised concerns, and for his trouble, he had been subtly and systematically blacklisted from the entire industry, his reputation ruined by quiet, vicious rumors orchestrated by Finch's network. Clara then opened her portfolio and laid her father's original, hand-drawn schematics on his small, rickety coffee table. For Marcus Thorne, it was like seeing a sacred text. He ran his fingers over the drawings with a reverence that bordered on worship. "This is it," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "The source code." "I knew it." He told her everything. He described the immense pressure from Finch to rush the design into production, the corners they were forced to cut, and the subtle flaws, like the harmonic resonance issue, that were introduced because they were trying to modify a system they didn't fully understand. He had kept his original work logs, his notes from the project, hidden away on an old, encrypted hard drive. It was his insurance policy, a secret he had guarded for 7 long years. He looked from the schematics to Clara's determined face, and in that moment, he made a decision. The fear that had ruled his life for so long was finally eclipsed by his desire for justice, for a chance to reclaim his own professional honor. He retrieved the hard drive, and together they accessed the files. It was the final, irrefutable piece of evidence: dated work logs, internal memos from Finch demanding the project be fast-tracked, and Thorne's own ignored warnings about the system's potential vulnerabilities. It was the smoking gun, a direct link from the stolen patents to the flawed product Finch was now selling for millions. Marcus Thorne agreed to sign a sworn affidavit, a detailed, technical account of the entire fraudulent enterprise. He knew the risk he was taking, knew that Finch would come after him with everything he had, but looking at Clara, he saw a chance for redemption. For the first time in years, the engineer in him, The builder, the man who believed in elegant solutions and objective truth, was more powerful than the fear. With Thorne's affidavit, their arsenal was complete. They had the original patents, the convoluted paper trail of the theft, and now, a credible insider witness who could explain every step of the fraud in excruciating technical detail. Professor Albright worked his legal magic, compiling the evidence into a damning, airtight presentation. The plan for the shareholder meeting was no longer a desperate gamble. It was a meticulously planned surgical strike. Albright secured the proxy pass, a single golden ticket into the heart of the enemy's fortress. Clara spent the final days not reviewing the evidence. She knew it by heart, but preparing herself mentally. She watched hours of footage of Alistair Finch, interviews, keynote speeches, public appearances. She studied his mannerisms, his vocal tics, the way he used condescending humor and corporate jargon to deflect and dominate. She was studying her opponent, learning his rhythms, preparing for the moment she would step into the ring with him. She was no longer motivated by the raw, emotional fury she had felt in the restaurant. That had been the catalyst, the spark. What drove her now was a cold, clear, and absolute sense of purpose. It was the same feeling she used to get when solving a particularly complex engineering problem, a state of pure, focused flow, where the entire universe narrowed down to the problem and its inevitable solution. Alistair Finch was no longer just the man who had ruined her father. He was a flawed system, a poorly designed machine built on a foundation of lies and theft. And she, Clara Vance, was the engineer who had found the fatal design flaw. She knew exactly where to apply the pressure, exactly which component to target to make the entire corrupt structure collapse in on itself. The night before the meeting, she did not try to sleep. She sat by the window of her small apartment, looking out at the endless grid of city lights, a landscape of human ambition and struggle. She thought about the duality of her life, the years spent in the shadows of Aura, moving silently among the very titans she was now preparing to challenge. She had been invisible to them, a ghost in a black uniform, but that invisibility had been her greatest asset. It had allowed her to watch, to listen, and to learn. Finch had dismissed her as a nobody, a prop in his personal drama, and that was the fatal miscalculation from which all of his other errors stemmed. He had failed to understand that the world is full of brilliant minds in unexpected places, and that true power does not always wear an expensive suit or announce itself with a booming voice. She picked up the simple, elegant business suit she had bought from a second-hand store, the armor she would wear into battle the next day. It felt foreign and familiar at the same time, a costume for a role she was finally ready to play, the role of herself. She laid it out carefully, a silent ritual of preparation. Beside it, she placed the leather portfolio. Inside, nestled between the legal documents and the sworn affidavit, was a single, small photograph of her father, taken in his workshop years ago. He was smiling, his eyes bright with intelligence and kindness, holding up a small, intricate lock he had just finished. She looked at the photograph, at the man whose legacy she was about to reclaim. "I'll make it right, Dad," she whispered into the quiet of the room. The promise was not a plea to a ghost. It was a statement of fact, the final calculation in a long and complex equation that was about to be solved. The stage for the checkmate was now fully and irrevocably set. The grand ballroom of the Hilton Midtown was a cathedral dedicated to the worship of capital. Alistair Finch stood on a brightly lit stage, a high priest before his congregation. A vast sea of dark, expensive suits and faces hardened by the relentless pursuit of profit. Giant screens flanked him, displaying a relentless upward trajectory of stock prices and market share, a visual sermon on the gospel of his success. He moved with a practiced predatory grace, his voice, amplified by the state-of-the-art sound system, filling every corner of the cavernous space. He spoke of integrity, of innovation, of a future built on the bedrock of Finch Capital's unwavering principles. The words were hollow, a polished veneer over a core of pure, unadulterated greed, but the audience drank them in. They were not here for truth, they were here for reassurance that the machine they had invested in would continue to generate impossible returns. Finch was the personification of their ambition, and in this room, on this day, he was infallible, a titan at the absolute zenith of his power, utterly oblivious to the single fatal flaw in the system he had built. Seated in the 20th row, a single, unassuming figure in a dark gray suit, Clara Vance was an island of absolute calm in the ocean of sycophantic applause. She felt the vibrations of the room, the low hum of the air conditioning, the collective exhalation of hundreds of people. But she was not a part of it. She was an observer, a scientist waiting for the precise moment to introduce a catalyst into a volatile chemical reaction. The leather portfolio in her lap felt cool and solid, a tangible anchor of truth in a room thick with deception. Her heart did not race. It beat with a slow, deliberate rhythm, a metronome counting down the final seconds of Alistair Finch's reign. She was not nervous. The fear had been burned out of her weeks ago, replaced by a crystalline certainty. She looked at the man on the stage, the architect of her family's pain, and she felt nothing but a detached, clinical focus. He was not a monster to be slain in a fit of rage. He was a complex problem, an equation she had spent a decade of her life, knowingly and unknowingly, preparing to solve. The final variable was about to be put into play. The moment arrived. Finch concluded his speech with a flourish, a self-satisfied smile spreading across his face as the room erupted in another wave of thunderous applause. He gestured magnanimously to the moderator, who announced the beginning of the annual question and answer session. Microphones were positioned in the aisles, and a few pre-selected individuals began to ask softball questions about profit margins and emerging markets. Clara waited. She let two of them go, allowing the rhythm of the event to settle, lulling Finch into an even deeper state of comfortable arrogance. Then, she stood. The simple act of rising to her feet felt momentous, a declaration of intent. She walked from her seat to the nearest microphone, her low heels making a soft, steady clicking sound on the polished floor of the aisle. It was a sound no one noticed, yet for her, it was the sound of an engine turning over, of a complex machine engaging its gears. Heads turned as she walked, a few curious glances cast in her direction. She was not one of the familiar faces, not a known journalist or a major investor. She was an anomaly, a ghost at the feast. She reached the microphone, its cool metallic surface, a stark contrast to the warmth of her hand. She adjusted its height, the small movement precise and deliberate. Across the vast expanse of the ballroom, Alistair Finch's eyes met hers. For a fraction of a second, a flicker of something crossed his face. Not recognition, but a faint, unsettling sense of dissonance, the brain's brief struggle to place a face that should not be there. He saw a professional woman, a shareholder, and his default setting of condescending charm kicked in. He gave her a tight, patronizing smile, a silent invitation for her to ask her question and return to the anonymity from which she had emerged. He was a king granting a brief audience to a commoner. The moderator's voice boomed, asking for her name and affiliation. Clara took a slow, steadying breath, the air filling her lungs, and she prepared to detonate the truth she had carried for so long. "My name is Clara Vance," she said, her voice perfectly level, carrying to every corner of the room with an unnerving clarity. "I am here today representing the shares held in the name of my father, Arthur Vance, the founder of a company you may remember, Mr. Finch. It was called Vance Security Innovations." A subtle ripple went through the first few rows. Where the older board members and investors sat, the name was a distant memory, a footnote in the company's history of aggressive acquisitions. Finch's smile did not falter, but a new, hard light entered his eyes. He was on guard now. Clara continued, her tone remaining conversational, almost academic. "My question concerns the security division of Finch Capital, specifically your flagship product, the OmniVault system. In your speech, you used the word innovation. Could you elaborate on the innovative process that led to the development of its core magnetic tumbler mechanism?" The question was a trap, perfectly baited. Finch, ever the salesman, launched into a slick pre-packaged response about their brilliant in-house R&D team and the years of tireless work that had led to the revolutionary, impenetrable design. He was building his own gallows, and Clara was handing him the rope. As he finished his self-congratulatory monologue, Clara gave a single, almost imperceptible nod to Professor Albright, who was seated in the front row with a small, powerful tablet projector. "You speak of innovation, Mr. Finch," she said, her voice hardening, taking on the sharp edge of a blade. "Let's talk about invention." A beam of light shot from Albright's device, and a high-resolution image filled the massive screen behind Finch. It was a schematic, a detailed technical drawing with precise, elegant handwriting and a signature in the bottom corner, Arthur Vance, dated 12 years prior. "This," she announced, her voice ringing with an authority that commanded absolute silence, "is page 12 of U.S. Patent Number 7, 137, 288. My father's original hand-drawn design for his magnetic tumbler system." Then, with a click, a second image appeared beside the first. It was Finch Capital's own marketing schematic for the OmniVault. The two images were nearly identical. A collective, audible gasp swept through the ballroom. The design was not similar. It was a mirror, a direct, undeniable copy. The truth, in all its stark visual clarity, was now on display for the entire world to see. The facade of Alistair Finch did not just crack, it shattered. The color drained from his face, leaving behind a sickly gray pallor. The confident smile was gone, replaced by a slack-jawed expression of pure, unadulterated horror. He stared at the screens, at the ghost of the man he had destroyed, his own hubris now projected 40 feet high behind him. The room, which moments before had been a sea of placid support, transformed into a maelstrom of chaos. Investors were on their phones, their voices sharp and panicked. Journalists were scrambling, flashes from their cameras firing like machine guns, capturing the precise moment of a Titan's implosion. Board members on the stage were staring at Finch with expressions of open-mouthed betrayal. He tried to speak, to deny, to call for security to remove her, but only a dry, croaking sound came out. His authority had evaporated in an instant. Clara's voice, cold and clear, cut through the pandemonium, delivering the final, killing blow. She held up a sheaf of papers. "And this," she said, "is a sworn affidavit from Marcus Thorne, your former senior engineer, detailing the systematic, deliberate fraud you perpetrated when you stole my father's life's work after bankrupting his company. You didn't innovate, Mr. Finch. You stole. You are not a builder. You are a thief." Type "justice" in the comments if you got chills when Clara Vance finally exposed the truth. The days and weeks that followed the shareholder meeting were a corporate firestorm of biblical proportions. The video of Clara's calm, surgical takedown of Alistair Finch went viral, a masterclass in righteous fury that was dissected on every major news network. The headlines were brutal, painting a picture not of a cunning businessman, but of a common corporate predator. Finch Capital's stock plummeted, losing over 60% of its value in a single week as investors fled the sinking ship in a panic. The board of directors, in a desperate act of self-preservation, convened an emergency meeting and unanimously voted to oust Finch, publicly disavowing him and launching a full-scale internal investigation. He was a pariah, his name transformed overnight, from a symbol of power to a synonym for fraud. The empire he had built on a foundation of stolen dreams crumbled into dust, and he found himself facing not just civil lawsuits from enraged shareholders, but a sweeping federal investigation into securities fraud and intellectual property theft. His downfall was not just financial, it was absolute, a public stripping of his power, his reputation, and the arrogant persona he had so carefully constructed. Amidst the wreckage of Finch's career, a new opportunity rose from the ashes for Clara. She received a call from a name she recognized from her father's old correspondence, Eleanor Vance, the CEO of Sterling Security, a rival technology firm known for its ethical practices and genuine commitment to innovation. Eleanor had been a friend and admirer of Arthur Vance, and had tried to form a partnership with him years before Finch's hostile takeover. She had watched the events of the shareholder meeting with a mixture of sorrow for the past and profound admiration for Clara's courage and brilliance. She didn't offer condolences or charity. She offered a future. She offered Clara the chance to lead a new, fully funded research and development division at Sterling, a division that would be named the Vance Innovation Lab. It was a chance not just to reclaim her father's work, but to advance it, to build upon his legacy, with the full resources and support of a company that shared his values. It was a restoration of not just a name, but of a purpose. The final scene of this chapter of her life did not take place in a gilded restaurant or a chaotic ballroom, but in the quiet, clean, and brightly lit space of her new laboratory. The air smelled of new electronics, whiteboard markers, and the limitless potential of a future reclaimed. Clara stood before a floor-to-ceiling smartboard, a complex, beautiful new design taking shape under her skilled hands. She was surrounded by a team of bright, eager young engineers who looked at her with a respect that bordered on reverence. She was not their boss. She was their mentor, their leader. Her movements were confident, her voice filled with the passion of a creator who had finally been set free. On the corner of her immaculate desk sat a small, framed photograph of her father. Not frail and lost, but vibrant and smiling in his old workshop. She had fulfilled her promise. She had not only brought a villain to justice, she had transformed the pain of her past into a foundation for a better future, ensuring that the Vance name would forever be associated not with tragedy, but with the brilliant, life-affirming act of creation. If Clara Vance's incredible journey from underdog to powerhouse inspired you, show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this story with someone who needs to see it. And for more unforgettable stories of justice and empowerment, don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell.